Hello, everyone, and welcome to what is our second session in Shine a Light on Antisemitism and Hinduphobia. Tonight, we will be talking about an interfaith response as part of the series in what Jews and Hindus can learn from each other. We have what I think is going to be a fantastic evening planned. I want to let everyone know that the first session of this series was recorded and is available on standwithus.tv. This session is also being recorded and should be available there next week. So without further ado, I will introduce myself and then let Samir, who is joining me this evening, do the same. This program is a joint effort between Stand With Us and the Hindu American Foundation. My name is Carly Gamble. I'm the director of the Stand With Us Center for Combating Anti-Semitism, and it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for being interested in learning about anti-Semitism, about Hinduphobia. We will also want to let you know that we will have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of this session. And so please feel free to put your questions in that Q&A feature box. Lastly, want to also let you know that we will have a little bit of an interactive component to the program. And so we invite you to please participate as we go along. And without further ado, let me introduce Samir Kaura and let him say a few words.
Great. Thank you so much, Carly. Namaste, good evening, and shalom to all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening for what's going to be a really exciting and hopefully a program where you're going to learn a lot about anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia, as well as learning a little bit about how you can combat it. So I am the managing director at the Hindu American Foundation, and I am an attorney by background. You could either hold that against me or look at that as a good thing. But I've been working on a number of issues ranging from legal advocacy work to Hinduphobia and hate crimes to policy work and education and a little bit of everything in between. So it's my pleasure to be here with all of you and to be co-hosting the program tonight with Carly. Back to you, Carly.
Great. Thanks so much. First things first, let's just talk a little bit about what you can expect tonight. We really have four goals for the evening. First, we're going to define anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia. Then we're going to learn how to identify these forms of bigotry. Third, we're going to empower you to help you to understand when it is that you might want to reach out for help if you find yourself targeted by either anti-Semitism or Hinduphobia, or if someone that you know finds him or herself targeted. And then lastly, we're going to talk about ways to partner with those of different backgrounds and really to build allyship between the Jewish and Hindu communities, but also if you're outside of those communities, how you can be a friend and a partner in the fight against Hinduphobia and anti-Semitism. Samir?
Great. And as Carly mentioned at the beginning, this is a series, one of many different programs that we're having. Last week, we had a program where we discussed a lot about the commonalities and challenges that Hindus and Jews share in common. So I'm just going to spend about a minute just going over a few of those. But if you want more detail on that, definitely check out the video of last week's program on standwithus.tv. So many people may not know, but Hindus and Jews actually share many commonalities ranging from religious festivals to marriage ceremonies, to having India and Israel as a sacred homelands for our respective communities. We also have very pluralistic societies in both India and Israel. And an interesting fact is that while we are ancient civilizations, we attained independence for our modern nation states within 10 months of each other. Israel was May 4th, 1948, and India was August 15th, 1947. Now, of course, on the flip side of that, unfortunately, we also share a number of challenges. Those challenges range from really dangerous stereotypes about what we believe in, how we act, all the way to violence, facing violence, both internationally as well as here in terms of hate crimes, and facing anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia, respectively, which, of course, is the focus of our program today. But before we actually talk about Hinduphobia and anti-Semitism specifically, we're going to play a little poll, put up one quick poll for you guys to just gauge your knowledge before we start the program. So if we can launch poll number one. Are you familiar with the definition of Hinduphobia? So just take a few seconds to answer that, yes or no, and we'll give you about 10 seconds or so, and then we'll go ahead and share the results. I have a timer in my head, but I'm not looking at a watch. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's end the poll and share the results. So a pretty close split here, about 60% say yes and 40% say no. So that's great in terms of we'll be educating hopefully a lot of you on what Hinduphobia actually is. So what is the actual definition of Hinduphobia? So a definition is only so good as the examples and the specifics that you can add to it. But I'm going to provide just a very brief high-level overview because a lot of that was discussed last week as well of what Hinduphobia is in terms of definition, and then I'll go into a few examples and specifics. So the basic definition is that Hinduphobia is a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Hinduism and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. And oftentimes you see a number of stereotypes associated with Hinduphobia. So you can see quite a range of different terms and slurs that are used to depict Hindus. And this starts in as early as textbooks that kids are learning. We see it in popular media, we see it in social media, and we oftentimes see it on college campuses and in the community when it crosses the line into violence. And we'll discuss that a little bit later. But some of the common terms that you see here are because of Hindus' reverence for the cow, referring to Hindus as cow piss drinkers, because both men and women wear either bindis for women or tikas for men and women, which are very symbolic and sacred on their foreheads, referred to as dot heads, oftentimes referred to as heathens, idol worshippers. And these terms, especially idol worshipper and heathen, are very derogatory in the sense that it's saying that, first of all, idol refers to false gods. So it's saying that any use of any physical statues is basically praying to false gods, when in actuality, Hindus use it as a way to concentrate and focus their energies on the divine through an image or a statue called murtis. Similarly, oftentimes other religions may refer to us as heathens because they feel that, and they don't understand Hinduism, and they feel that it's some type of a backwards religion, when the reality is it's actually a very high philosophical and spiritual religion. So those are just a few of the common stereotypes, of course, not all of them, but just a few that you commonly see associated with Hinduphobia. What are some of the broad examples of actual Hinduphobia, and how do you recognize it? Well, the most obvious is violence, but more subtle than that is, when Hindus are not just targeted for violence, but then that violence is normalized. And that, I think, is very dangerous because, outward violence, it's much easier to combat. But when people are justifying the violence and saying they deserve it for X, Y, and Z reason, and normalize it and as a result dehumanize Hindus, that's when it becomes even more dangerous. There's denial and destruction. So denial is that basically Hindus have never suffered, denies any historic or contemporary violence against Hindus, whether that is occurring in India, other parts of South Asia, here in the US, or anywhere in the world. And then when you talk about it, they accuse Hindus of exaggerating or making it up, and it not being based in fact. When on the other hand, it is actually very well documented in several instances, both historically as well as in contemporary times. And then there's outright destruction, calling for the actual destruction and dissolution of Hinduism. And finally, the third category, as I like to call it, is silencing. Now, this is what we see very often here in the US, and we're seeing it more often on social media, in academic spaces, and in many other places, where anybody that tries to speak up to talk about Hinduphobia, or anybody that talks about facing violence, historic violence or contemporary violence, they're automatically accused of being an extremist or being pawns of violent, oppressive political agendas that are there in India, allegedly in India. So that silencing, again, is very dangerous because, number one, the Hinduphobia is already there, and it's occurred in some form, whether through violence, targeting, or normalizing. And then it happens secondarily when somebody tries to speak up about it, and they are then silenced. So before we go on to the next slide, there's another concept that has become very commonly associated with Hinduism, Hindus, and India. This is the concept of Hindutva. If we can put up our poll question, so we want to gauge a little bit of your knowledge on this concept. So this is a true or false question. Hindutva is a violent, fascist, Hindu nationalist ideology. True or false? I'll give you a few more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll and show the results. Yeah, well, this is actually very heartening that only 7% actually think that this concept is associated with violence and fascism, and 93% feel that it is not, and it is a false statement. And I can go ahead and close that poll. And this is where we see kind of a new evolution of Hinduphobia. And this is not just in India, South Asia, it's everywhere. And this is accusing people, Hindus, of being part of this fascist ideology. And we've seen a lot of rhetoric, a lot of activism around this. There was a conference, for instance, last year that was called Dismantling Global Hindutva, which was ostensibly to dismantle this violent fascist ideology. But then within 5 minutes within the conference, they actually went on to talk about destroying Hinduism at large. So we know what the motivations are to try to use the terminology to actually use it to demonize Hindus in general. We see students facing this on campuses very frequently. We talked about the silencing that occurs with Hinduphobia, and anytime you do speak up, this is one of the common terms that's used to thrown against you, that you are a Hindutva extremist, you are a fascist, etc., etc. But what actually is Hindutva? So the word Hindutva is a combination of terms, and it just basically means the essence of Hinduism. Now, these are three definitions, or three people or groups that have spoken about it. One is the Indian Supreme Court, and they have said that Hindutva is actually a way of life, a state of mind that is not to be equated with or understood as religious Hindu fundamentalism. It's actually more talking about the culture and being native to India and being part of that geography, that sacred geography. And you can be from any religion. You don't have to be Hindu to be considered an adherent of Hindutva. Second is coming from Veer Savarkar, who is considered the father of Hindutva. And he basically said that, if we're talking about this is supposed to be a fascist ideology, the father of it is saying that everyone in India should have equal rights and obligations, irrespective of caste, creed, race, or religion. And finally, one of the largest socio-religious charitable organizations, service organizations in India, the RSS, has talked about Hindutva as an ideology that takes everyone along. It brings everyone together. It unites everyone within itself, and it makes everyone prosper. And again, that is irrespective of race, religion, creed, or caste. So this is the reality, but unfortunately, this term is often used as a way to demonize Hindus and silence them. I'm going to pass it back to you, Carly.
Thanks so much, Samir. That was actually really enlightening. Before we move on, I'm going to ask for the next poll question. Hope you guys are enjoying being a little bit interactive. So if we can put up this question here is just, are you familiar with the definition of anti-Semitism? Again, give you just a minute to answer that, and then we'll put up the results. Okay, well, so it looks like we've got almost 80% who say that they feel familiar with the definition. As Samir said, it's always nice, though, to know that there's part of the audience who hopefully is going to learn something new. And the truth is, generally, that's all of us. So let's go ahead and look at the definition of anti-Semitism. And the definition that we're going to use is the Consensus International Definition of Anti-Semitism, which was established by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It's an international body made up of 30 plus democratic governments. And so what they have come up with and we now use as the definition of anti-Semitism is simply this, that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And one of the things that I think is really important about that definition is the fact that it acknowledges that anti-Semitism can target individuals who are not Jewish. For example, myself. I am not Jewish, and yet, partially because of my professional role, but also just because of my personal feelings and decisions to support the Jewish community and to support and educate about Israel, I can and easily, at times have been in situations where anti-Semitic remarks and comments have been directed toward me because of my feelings, my positions, my views and support, like I said. So I think it's really important that we understand that anti-Semitism affects not just Jews, but the larger community. Another thing that's really important about this definition is the fact that it comes with some explanatory guidance. As Samir said, the definitions that we use really are only as good as the information that we have that kind of goes along with it to flesh that out a little bit more, to give examples, to bring some practical understanding about how do we understand what anti-Semitism really is and what it looks like. And one of the things that the IHRA thought was particularly important, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, is the concept and the need to emphasize, as I have here in emphasis in this next paragraph, that criticism of Israel, even though anti-Semitism may sometimes target the state of Israel, that we're distinguishing between not just criticism of Israel that is similar to that leveled against any other country, right? That's not anti-Semitic, but instead we're talking about something more. We're talking about things that demonize and delegitimize the state of Israel, the applying of a double standard, right? Those are the things that we're talking about when we talk about Israel-related anti-Semitism, not merely criticism that's similar to that leveled against other countries. And so that's a really important point. And I think it's worth mentioning too that there is controversy at times surrounding this definition, and that's one of the claims that gets made is that the IRA definition says that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and in fact, on its face, the guidance is very clear that that's not the case. So let's talk for a minute about, as Samir did with Hinduphobia. Again, there are examples that IRA has provided here, and I didn't put this language up. I highly encourage you, if you're interested in knowing more about this, to really sit and take some time to familiarize yourself with the IHRA definition and these examples. These are the contemporary examples. But again, what's really clear is that the IHRA was very nuanced here, and the introductory language to these examples makes clear that these are not per se anti-Semitism, right? But that these could be, depending upon the overall context, examples of anti-Semitism. And so that it's always crucial and it's key to look at the overall context of what's being said and what's being done. So again, these are 11 contemporary examples. Some of them have to do with more traditional forms of anti-Semitism. And again, I'll point you back to the first session in this series, which really kind of went through some of the more historical examples, stereotypes, things like that. And then it brings us all the way into the present, where, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Jewish state of Israel, which is seen as the Jewish collective, is often used kind of as a proxy, as a stand-in, and treated the way that Jews individually once were. Now the Jewish collective state of Israel becomes the target at times of anti-Semitism. So again, without going into each one of those, I encourage you to really take some time to sit with and learn these examples, so that when you see these things happening, that red flag goes up and you say, oh, this could be anti-Semitic, and then you know to engage in a contextual analysis. So with that, let's do one more poll question. If we can put up the fourth one. This is another true or false, and it's simply this: anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Again, take just a moment. All right, so we have 70% saying true, and we have 30% saying false. And I will acknowledge that that this can be confusing, and so I think we're going to take just a minute to walk through the explanation to this. So you see here just a little cartoon that I think really embodies this notion, right? The old anti-Semitism would have said something like Jews are evil, demonic, and they kill babies, use some sort of a slur. The new anti-Semitism, which is anti-Zionism, that's the term that gets used most often. Instead of saying that Jews are, it says the Jewish state is evil, demonic, and they kill babies. Again, like I said, it's using the state of Israel as a proxy, as a stand-in. But in order to understand whether anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism, we have to back up just a little bit, and we have to look at the definition of Zionism, right? So here it is. Zionism is an expression of the Jewish people's connection to Israel and support for the right of Jews to self-determination in their ancestral home. And just to provide a little more context for that, there's a lot here, so I'll read it quickly for you. But this explanation, it's a little more than just a definition, says that for most Jews around the world, Zionism and Israel form an integral part of Jewish identity. Israel is the birthplace of Jewish ethnic identity, language, culture, and religion, and Jews have maintained a constant presence there for over 3,000 years. Zionism represents the Jewish people's unbreakable bond and age-old desire to be free in their ancestral home, where over half the world's Jews currently live. Jews endured over 1,900 years of oppression and violence across Europe and the Middle East and still live in a world plagued by anti-Semitism. In this context, Israel's existence and well-being is vital to the Jewish people's safety, survival, and human rights. I know that's a mouthful. What I really want to focus on here, though, is the very first part of this explanation that makes it very clear that for most, not all, but for most Jews around the world, Zionism and Israel are a part of their identity. It's a part of what it means to them to be Jewish. And so if that's the case, if Zionism is a part of Jewish identity and it's an expression of what it means to be Jewish, think of other forms of Jewish identity and how that gets expressed, whether it be keeping kosher, for example, in the way that a Jewish person eats, or where a man wearing a yarmulke, things like this that express their Jewish identity. Zionism can also be expressed. It can be expressed culturally, religiously, politically. But again, if it's a part of identity, and then we look at the word anti-Zionism. If you are anti someone's identity, we typically call that discrimination, right? An attack against a component of identity we know as discrimination. And discrimination against Jews is anti-Semitism. So with this understanding of Zionism as a component of identity, then the answer to our poll, the correct answer would be true. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Let's move on here and let's look just real quickly. I just want to talk facts and figures for just a second so that we kind of have an understanding of, why this even really matters. This is a graph from the FBI. It's their hate crime statistics report from 2020. I will note that the 2021 report just came out. There are a number of problems and concerns with that in terms of whether things were accurately reported. So we're going to stick with the 2020 data for our purposes here. And you see here that religion made up 13.3% of the bias-motivated hate crimes that were reported to the FBI. And what I want to point out here is that there are two things before I turn it back over to Samir. One is that of those religious-based hate crimes, over 50% of those targeted Jews. That's a staggering number. The other thing that I want to point out, though, is that these statistics treat Jews only within the religion category. But we just talked about how there is an ethnicity, right? A national ethnicity component to Jewish identity as well in terms of Zionism and the connection to Israel. And so that's not even accounted for. And so we know that of the religious-based hate crimes, over half of those targeted Jews. We don't really have a number, but it is, I think, safe to say that there are, there's a large number of anti-Semitic hate crimes that aren't even encompassed within these numbers, and so it's even greater. Samir?
Yeah, thank you, Carly. And I think you raised some great points here. One is the conflation between religion and race and ethnicity, and that's something that we face in the Hindu American community as well, is that while the overall statistics based on anti-Hindu as a separate category of crimes are relatively low, and in 2021, I believe it was 10, a lot of times those that fall into the race or ethnicity category as Indians or other South Asians, that is so difficult to kind of separate because religious identity is so closely tied to ethnic identity. And that's particularly the case for Indian Americans. And there oftentimes are multiple factors at play: immigration status, ethnicity, religion, etc. And this, in the minds of the perpetrator, those things are all together, but how it actually translates into what it's categorized as is kind of very black and white. And it kind of is very difficult then to actually get a real handle on what's happening. The second thing, and Carly alluded to some of the controversy, is that there is a gross underreporting. And the underreporting is happening in two ways. I think where the controversy is because law enforcement departments are not necessarily required to report hate crimes data to the FBI. And so if it's a non-mandatory reporting mechanism, oftentimes you're going to be missing out on a lot of data, a lot of information, and a better and more accurate sense of the numbers. Number two is, and this is, obviously issues with communities that may not feel comfortable actually reporting some of this information, or they may not understand what is actually a hate crime. So we see a lot of incidents that should be categorized as hate crimes not being done so because the communities themselves are feeling apprehensive, or they just don't understand, what is a hate crime versus what is hate speech, and all of that. And so there's a lot of work to do, I think, from both ends. One is to educate our communities to report it, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little while, as well as getting mandatory law enforcement reporting of this data to the FBI. But I think now we kind of talked a little bit respectively about what anti-Semitism and what Hinduphobia are in terms of words. But now I think we want to get into, well, what happens beyond the words? And this is where we see a lot on campus. And I think this is probably similar for the Jewish community, or it's definitely similar for the Jewish community, where you see a lot of anti-Semitism happening on campus as you do with the Hindu American community. And within the Hindu American community, we see primarily three types of Hinduphobia on campus. One is related to kind of this anti-India activism or anti-Hindutva activism, and everything again is conflated together, where you speak out on any policy that's happening in India being implemented, or any issue. And the issues there, let me tell you, are very complex. They oftentimes are, unfortunately, put into these kind of very black and white boxes here, either in the media or otherwise. But the complexity is much greater on the ground in India. And so anybody that speaks out in favor of a policy that's being implemented in India, regardless of what it's about, is automatically silence. Anybody again that we talked about speaking about violence that's happening against Hindus, they're silenced. So a lot of times we see this manifesting either in students on campus actually being shut down, or conversely actually being afraid to speak in the first place. There are repercussions because the power is oftentimes in the hands of professors, and professors hold these views. They're activist scholars, not necessarily actual scholars that are objective. And this happens oftentimes in classrooms dealing with South Asia studies or religious studies, where Hinduism and India are talked about. The second area, which I'll talk briefly about, is disrupting holidays on campus. And this is, I think, very, very dangerous in terms of the trend that we're seeing now, is where activist groups on campus are trying to actually make political statements out of our very sacred holidays. Two of the most prominent are Holi, which is the festival of colors that takes place in the spring, and actually is a festival of new beginnings and bringing people together and uniting people, and is being attacked and is used to make political statements. And the second is perhaps one of the largest and most widely celebrated Hindu festivals, which is Diwali, which normally happens in the fall. And Diwali is, again, it's a festival that celebrates the victory of knowledge over ignorance, light over darkness, and good over evil. And again, it's being used as a way to demonize Hindus, to shut them down, to prevent them from being open about their Hindu identity, from students from openly celebrating. And so we've seen this activism kind of increasing and targeting holidays, these two in particular. And the third and perhaps most misunderstood concept is that of caste and the implementation of caste policies under the cloak of anti-discrimination policies on college campuses. Now, caste, again, is one of those very, very complex subjects. It's not even a native Indian term. It is a Portuguese term. And when the British first were colonizing India, they created a caste system to try to understand and categorize the very diverse population that they saw in India and try to make some sense of it and actually to rule over it. And it has tried to conflate two very different indigenous or multiple indigenous concepts and put them together to talk about this caste system that appears in this pyramid, and there's no way to get out of this pyramid, which is very far from the truth. Now, is there discrimination on the ground in India? Has there been discrimination, amongst different communities? Of course there has, but it's much more complex, and it's much more diverse in how it plays out in India and what the issues are than what is presented here. The other part of that is that in America, most Americans, and this is supported by Carnegie Endowment study, caste is not an important issue, and people don't actually face caste discrimination here in the US. But what we're seeing is this trend by some activist groups of trying to implement caste policies on campuses. So they're adding to the general non-discrimination policies a category that says it cannot discriminate based on caste. Now, how do they define caste? They're defining it as a Hindu concept, when Hindu scriptures in no way support any type of discrimination or a caste system or caste. The other part of that is that, if there are actual instances of discrimination, they should be handled under all the neutral laws that already exist. So for instance, discrimination based on ethnicity or ancestry is something that can handle caste discrimination, and it's a neutral category, meaning that it doesn't matter whether you are African American, you're Caucasian, you're Jewish, you're Hindu, you're Muslim. Everyone can take protection under those laws. But what caste does is it uniquely associates one particular law with the Hindu American community, and basically inherently says that we are discriminatory and we're going to be treated with suspicion and we deserve our own set of laws. It's a type of religious and racial profiling. So that's what we're seeing on campuses. Those are the types of different policies that we're seeing. Now, what happens when we see what we see in the actual community beyond campuses? We see an uptick in incidents of actual hate crimes and assaults on Hindu institutions, on Hindu individuals, and not in the US, but in the UK recently, actual riots, anti-Hindu riots in Leicester in the UK. And I think what is interesting to note here is that how hate crimes have been traditionally looked at is that it's been, if you're a minority, if you're a Hindu American or an Indian American, that the person that's perpetrating that hate crime against you is assumed to be white or white extremists or white nationalists, etc. But what we're seeing, and which is quite disturbing, is that it's coming from within the broader South Asian community. So the first example on the left here was an attack on a Hindu temple and a statue outside of a Hindu temple in Queens, New York, where a statue of Mahatma Gandhi was decapitated and basically hacked to pieces. And the word dog is written there. Now, oftentimes these types of attacks, they're conflating again, ethnic issues, religious issues. So in this case, it was an attack on Gandhi, who is seen as a symbol of Hindus and India. And of course, no person is perfect. He had his flaws, but this is used to send a message of anti-Hindu activism. In the second picture here, you see an attack and an assault on an individual in the town that I'm based in, Fremont, California. A person that was assaulted, spit on, called a dirty Hindu, a cow piss drinker, while the Hindu individual was just going to get a meal from Taco Bell for his family and his kids. And finally, on the picture on the right, were riots that took place earlier this year in Leicester, UK, where a lot of anti-Hindu rhetoric was spread amongst the Muslim community there, and you saw some extremists going and attacking temples, going and attacking Hindu homes, where Hindus to the level were not even safe to come out of their houses. They were scared. There was a lot of fear in these neighborhoods where these incidents were happening, and that was accompanied by a lot of anti-Hindu rhetoric, a lot of accusing people of being, Hindutva extremists, and that therefore they're justified to attack them, when in fact the police found that there was no evidence of any activity by any of the Hindus that precipitated the riots and the violence against them. So this is kind of, a little bit of what we're seeing in the community today. And I know that we're seeing similar things, and as those statistics very unfortunately laid out in terms of anti-Semitism and violence both on campuses as well as in the community. So Carly, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Samir. Then that's exactly right. It's as you noted at the very outset of our session here, that there are some common challenges that Hindus and Jews are facing, and so let's talk about anti-Semitism on campus. This is, again, in no way intended to cover all the bases, but really more just to give you an overview if you're not aware, if you're not familiar with what anti-Semitism looks like on campus. For one thing, I don't want to ignore the fact that more classic forms of anti-Semitism, things like swastikas being drawn on known Jewish buildings like Hillel buildings, Chabad houses, things like that. So vandalism with anti-Semitic intent and speech involved is something that's continuing to happen, and we're seeing that fairly regularly on campus. So that's and that's happening not just on the exterior of buildings. Students are seeing things in classrooms and bathrooms, things like comments glorifying Hitler. You name it in terms of anti-Semitic slurs. Those things that are kind of known anti-Semitic slurs, again, using swastikas, using derogatory terms toward Jews, things like that. Those are continuing to happen. What's happening more and more, and really has been for about the last 10 to 12 years at least, is more Israel related. It's become very popular for the social justice movements on campus to delegitimize, to demonize Israel, the things I talked about earlier, to applying double standards to Israel. But beyond that, what ends up happening when it comes to Jewish students is there's a litmus test that gets applied to Jewish students. And it essentially goes like this. If you are a Jewish person on campus who has a connection to the state of Israel, that has Zionism as a part of what it means for you to be Jewish, then you either have to shed that, right, and hide it or disavow it, or you won't be welcome in this space or that space. We've seen that in so many different ways. And that's really kind of how that started, right? It was just that those students were made to feel very unwelcome. In fact, at one university several years ago, over 50 student organizations got together and signed a petition agreeing that they wouldn't host events or partner in any way with the two groups, student groups on campus that were pro-Israel for this reason. So that is really kind of the tenor of how these things started. And it's under the guise of what you see here on the screen, this BDS movement. And again, if you're not familiar with that, what that stands for is boycott, divestment, sanctions. And so it portrays itself, again, as a social justice movement seeking to better the plight of the Palestinian people. What doesn't get talked about sometimes in those conversations is the fact that the BDS movement and BDS campaigns at their core, right? And when I say at their core, I mean based on the founders and their statements, they made it very clear that their goal is not simply to improve upon policies or practices of the Israeli government with which they disagree, but rather it is the elimination altogether of the Jewish state of Israel. And so that's where you'll hear phrases like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." What that means is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, the land mass that is the modern state of Israel, that will no longer be Israel, but instead will be known as Palestine, and there will not be a Jewish state. That's the goal. And so again, these things all fall under BDS. And so you see here, there's annually on many campuses something called Israeli Apartheid Week. So Israel is accused of being an apartheid state. That is a fallacious claim. Nonetheless, it gets made, and it is through misinformation and disinformation that this notion gets spread to largely uninformed students and others on campus, who then begin to believe that is the case. And so they do this week on campuses each year, in which they, right above that, you see a picture of a checkpoint, a mock checkpoint that is supposed to be an Israeli IDF soldier and Palestinians who are being targeted with violence there. And so you see things like that, and behind them there's a wall with many just false claims about the state of Israel. And so this is what Jewish students are subjected to. And it's essentially, if these aren't your views, then you are a bigot, you're a racist, you're a colonialist. These are the things that the pro-Israel Jewish students are being called. And you see here on the far left, this was actually commentary that was made in a public meeting of a student organization, where one student said, "I have no interest in dialoguing with Zionists," and someone else says, "I feel the same way. I don't have the energy to engage with the Zionists." And this is the conversation that was happening as a Jewish student who is known to be a Zionist was being held in the waiting room and not allowed to join the meeting. And so this is what we mean when we say, that they're not welcome and not treated equally with others. And then another trend that has become more and more popular, we're seeing issues like this arise in the classroom from professors targeting their students or targeting Jews as a whole or Zionists as a whole. You see the post here, the Zionist brain, with many derogatory ideas leveled at Zionists, was actually posted by a professor in his capacity as a professor at a public university. And then on the right, you have an email that you can see the subject is academic letter of recommendation for semester abroad. And in a nutshell, a student had asked a professor for a letter of recommendation as she was planning to study abroad, and the professor agreed. Subsequently, when the professor found out that the student planned to study abroad in Israel, he reneged and said, "I'm sorry, I can't do that because I support the BDS movement." Unfortunately, the problem with that is that this student obviously was meritorious in the professor's eyes, only because of her support for Israel and academic engagement in Israel did he say that he would not write that letter of recommendation. And so these are the issues that Stand With Us is regularly addressing on campuses, helping students to respond to this, dealing with administrations. I can tell you that the good news is that things are improving, that these are situations in which we have been able to get involved and to have a successful resolution where students are getting the support that they need. But nevertheless, this is what they are facing on a regular basis on campus today. And just as Samir shared with regard to Hinduphobia, anti-Semitism is not limited to campus, but obviously is happening in the broader community. And so again, just a snapshot of what that looks like. Again, vandalism is fairly common, whether that be in Jewish cemeteries, other buildings known to be owned by Jewish individuals or institutions. We're seeing, obviously, I think it'll be no surprise to anyone that we're seeing quite a bit of anti-Semitism online on social media. This is a major concern because it's really easy to hide behind the comments that one makes on social media. Even if there's a name associated with an account, it's not a face-to-face encounter. And so it's emboldening to share these things. And again, misinformation, disinformation is shared, it's spread. And as we know, a lie told enough times in many people's minds becomes known as the truth. And so social media presents a particular challenge in that regard. Educating social media companies, their leadership is also part of the work that we do to try to mitigate that damage. You see here in the middle There's actually a picture from an assault that took place in Los Angeles, but it was actually something that was happening worldwide in the wake of the May 2021 war in Israel with Gaza. And so what we were seeing at that time, again, around the world, was people just driving around and hopping out of their cars and asking, who here is Israeli, but who here is Jewish? They were, had Palestinian flags, flying from their vehicles and would hop out. And so that's what happened at this diner in LA, where there were individuals sitting outside. And that was the question, who here is Jewish? And then a physical assault ensued. So again, physical assaults are becoming more and more of a problem in certain locations, obviously in larger cities as well. You see here on the bottom right, that's a picture of a synagogue. We've had a couple of synagogue shootings. We had a hostage situation involving a synagogue. And so much of this comes from, again, if you go back and you watch the first session in this series, I know that there was talk about conspiracy theories and scapegoating Jews and really kind of some of the crux of anti-Semitism historically, and that's where some of these things are coming from as well. Especially the hostage situation with the synagogue was one where because the individual believed that Jews have power, there was a particular rabbi that he wanted to be contacted in order to help get a prisoner released from prison. Just that mindset of control and power of Jews writ large. And then lastly, here at the top, again, something that is happening more and more frequently is these public displays from overpasses or people standing, on street corners with posters and banners, making anti-Semitic statements and claims. And I know this was a small picture here, it's hard to see, but what it says is, honk if you know Kanye is right about the Jews. And so obviously referencing Kanye West's anti-Semitic comments that he made on social media. And so these people have taken the opportunity to publicize their view that he's absolutely right. They're a known anti-Semitic group. This is coming from far right. And so, again, a lot of this, as Samir mentioned, it comes from so many different sources. That one in particular is more coming from the far right. The more anti-Zionist forms of anti-Semitism tend to come from the far left. And then we also see, radical Islamism playing a role in this as well. So these are, again, just continuing issues that we are addressing through our educational and action efforts. But again, just a snapshot of what anti-Semitism looks like within the community. I think this is a good point to bring in a little bit of our legal expertise. Samir mentioned earlier that he is an attorney, as am I, and so and in particular, my practice some years ago was specifically with regard to constitutional issues, First Amendment issues. And so since those come up so often when we're dealing with anti-Semitism, Hinduphobia, particularly on campus, but also to a degree within the community, we just thought it would be helpful to maybe give a couple of points and kind of highlights in terms of helping you to understand when you might want to reach out for help. When, for example, if you have someone on campus who experiences some of this bigotry, having that red flag go up, kind of having a better understanding. So let's talk for just a minute about, let's see, Samir, I don't know if you can advance. For some reason, mine's not working. There we go. Thanks. Let's talk about free speech. So general rule, private parties, whether that's individuals or say a private university, a private company, they can limit the speech of, say, employees, or of others under their control, right? Because when we talk about the Constitution, we talk about free speech, which is part of the First Amendment rights that are protected. We're talking about limitations on the government, right? And so that means then that public universities, which are public entities, are the ones that generally cannot limit and restrict speech. However, there are times, there are places, there are manners of speech that can be restricted by those public entities. What's important to note is that it's the content that cannot generally be restricted. And so, when we're talking about a public or government entity, for them to set rules to, for example, to say, that classrooms, are not an open forum for students to stand up and say whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, that's a reasonable time, place, manner restriction. But it's not based on the content of what a student might say, or the viewpoint is often another word that gets used there. So that's just kind of a general overview in terms of free speech. And before I move on from that, Samir, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, and I think this is important because we often get questions about somebody said X, Y, and Z, and I think it's always very critical to look at the context. Where did this speech take place? What was accompanying the speech? And I think just like in any other, I think legal issue, context, facts are critical to look at. So, for instance, if somebody wants to hold a protest, now they can still hold a protest, but where they hold it can be limited and can be restricted how they hold it. But what they're saying cannot be limited. And again, where is it happening, right? Schools obviously have more leeway in terms of limiting speech, as maybe there may be in a public street or somewhere out in public. So I think every time you look at speech, even if the speech is very offensive, is very hateful, you always have to look at the circumstances and the context to see whether it actually can be limited or it should have been limited or something else needs to be done. And sometimes even if it can't legally be restricted, there are ways to respond to hateful speech. That doesn't always mean shutting down the speech. Maybe that means more speech and countering it with different speech. So these are all the factors that have to be looked at when dealing with these types of issues.
Thank you. And that is a perfect segue into our next slide, which is about hate speech. And this is something that's often misunderstood. So again, just to provide a little bit of clarity when it comes to this, that as frustrating as it might be, hate speech, that offensive, horrible stuff that gets said about Jews, about Hindus, about anyone, but in this context, generally, hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. And again, what that means is generally, there are some caveats there and some exceptions, but generally, the government cannot restrict or punish hate speech. However, if you go beyond that, and that speech occurs during the commission of a crime, then that crime turns into a hate crime. So let's just say, for example, there's vandalism. Right? Vandalism is a crime. If the message of that vandalism is anti-Semitic or Hinduphobic, then that becomes a hate crime, right? The speech itself is protected, but it becomes part of the overall crime. And again, all that means is a hate crime. When we say that, we use that term, is just a crime motivated by bias based on race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, right? These protected characteristics. And so often what that means in practice is that the sentencing, right? If someone is arrested and convicted for that hate crime, because it is a hate crime, it's not just vandalism now, right? It's anti-Semitic vandalism or it's Hinduphobic hate crime, it's bias crime, then the sentence can be steeper depending upon the laws in any given state. And so, that's something that, Samir and I both utilize in the work that we do when we see these types of incidents, and also providing some of the information that we've provided to you to law enforcement, right? To make sure that they understand, for example, what Hinduphobia looks like, what anti-Semitism looks like, so that when they are investigating crimes, if there is a possibility that it could be a hate crime, they have that information.
Yeah, and before I go to the next slide, just one thing to add here is that it's actually difficult to prove bias and motivation in terms of a hate crime. And there, unfortunately, are only a few instances when it is very clear and apparent. One of those is speech. One of those is, any types of things that are graffiti or, things that are written that are hateful in nature. And so that kind of brings us to our next slide in why it's so important to be able to use the right tools to combat anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia. And one of those is documenting things, reporting it, making sure that you take good notes. So if something has happened, if somebody said something to you, you have to make sure you take down good notes and you report it, because that becomes the evidence of the bias if it's actually a hate crime. And it all starts with educating again, and educating yourselves and educating others. And this goes back to even what is Hinduphobia, how to recognize it, what is anti-Semitism, how to recognize it, how does it play out in terms of actual incidents, particularly when it comes to actual hate crimes. So the education component, the reporting component, the documenting component becomes absolutely critical. And if you don't have some sort of documentation and you don't report it, we looked at those statistics before and we had a conversation about how that doesn't even come close to actually capturing the true number of incidents that are occurring. So that's why it's important to report things, to document things, and to first educate yourself and others. It's also important, as Carly was talking about, know the distinctions between what is just speech, hate speech, versus what is a hate crime. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't still report if you're not sure. So if you're not sure if it's hate speech or a hate crime, still you should actually report it, and maybe the police will come and investigate it and they'll find that it wasn't an actual hate crime. But it's still important to make sure that you are notifying them of that, filing a report, because you never know, that may actually then lead to something else. Maybe it was just speech the first time and it's therefore not, it doesn't rise to the level of a hate crime. But maybe that same person then takes it and ratchets it up and it ends up being a hate crime in a subsequent incident. So you want to make sure you still call if you're unsure, you still report it, but try to educate yourself on what is the difference between these concepts. What is free speech? What is protected? And of course, if you're unsure, we have two great resources with us, with Stand With Us, with the Hindu American Foundation, and many other great resources obviously out there, but we're going to promote ourselves because we're here. And reach out to us, ask us. Oftentimes we can help provide that guidance, not just in knowing, but if it doesn't fall into the category of an illegal behavior, maybe there's still some way to combat it and still some way to counter that. And probably one of the most important things of what we are doing here today is building relationships. We're building relationships with communities that are affected by similar types of issues. Obviously, the specifics may be different, but a lot of the larger narratives are very similar, conflating countries with religious identities, kind of creating these conspiracy theories about our communities. So there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and a lot of ways that we can partner. And so we have to develop those relationships. Oftentimes, if we want to take on something, it's so much easier to have multiple voices taking on an issue as opposed to one group or one individual doing it on their own. Now, the other thing is that, it's easy to be silenced, but it takes a lot of courage to fight back. But if we don't fight back, we're never going to be able to push back against a lot of these incidents. So fighting it when it occurs is equally important. And I think, we all feel that, our jobs or our education is so important. But if we think by staying silent, those things are going to go away and it's not going to occur tomorrow, we're gravely mistaken. So it takes courage. It's hard, but we should fight. We should stand up and we should speak out when these incidents do occur and ask for help. Find allies, come to our organizations, but definitely don't stay silent. And I think knowing how to address it and how to approach it is where our professional expertise comes in, and where we can go a long way. And Carly alluded to actually having a lot of success stories on these issues. And it's important to know that there's a way to approach these issues. But, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, as an individual, stand out, but also come and seek out the professional advice and guidance to help, smooth out that process. And so those are just a few of the tools that we wanted to talk about in terms of working on these issues, addressing it, and working together. So we're almost at time, but before we end the program, we have one last poll that we wanted to get to. And I think hopefully then we can maybe get to a couple of audience questions before we wrap up. So this is our last question. Do you now feel better prepared to address Hinduphobia and anti-Semitism? Two choices, yes or no, and we'll give you a few seconds to answer that. and then we'll go ahead and share the results. I know I feel better prepared and I feel more knowledgeable about anti-Semitism, so that should be a good sign. So let's see. Yes, 88%. That is great. So that shows that, we're making a difference. Coming to this is obviously just the first step. And before we close, I think maybe we have time for a couple of questions here. I don't know, Stephanie, do we have any questions that we have a few minutes to take, or?
Yeah, Samir, actually, I noticed there were a couple that were really directly related to what we spoke about in the free speech portion. And so I just wanted to quickly address those that we were asked about interruptions and disruptions. And that's something that we do see on a regular basis, particularly on campus, but also within the community. And in fact, I'm so appreciative that question came up, because the reality is that the First Amendment right to freedom of speech encompasses and protects not just the speaker's right to speak, but also the listener's right to hear what is being said. And so, no, that would not be protected speech. Generally, there are rules that are consistent with the First Amendment. So again, if you're on for example, a public campus, public university, government, actor campus, and the law enforcement on that campus doesn't allow you to shout down a speaker, but instead escorts you out, they are within their rights to do that. You are not within your rights to silence that speaker. So if there is a substantial disruption, then they are absolutely within their rights. They will not be violating anyone's constitutional rights by removing those disruptors. And then related to that, someone asked the question of whether nonprofits are public or private, in the sense that we're talking about those are private institutions, right? So when we say public, what we mean is government actors. So wanted to quickly get those in. And Samir, I don't know if you had any others that you saw that we might be able to quickly respond to.
Sure. I think there are a lot of questions. Let's see here. I'm just trying to make my way through it. Oh, here we go. I'll take this one. So what can the U.S. administration, Congress, and the Justice Department do, or what are they doing to stop these crimes? That's a great question. And I would say that, there have been some pieces of legislations. I think there was the No Hate Act, I believe. Carly, I can't recall the exact terminology, but that was meant to, better prevent and address hate crimes. A lot of this happens at the state level, though. And I think one of the big things is having better definitions of hate crimes. So, for instance, there have been some cases recently in Santa Clara County in the Bay Area, in Northern California, for instance, where targeting the Hindu American community was actually prosecuted as a hate crime. Now, there weren't statements, there wasn't any writing and saying that I hate Hindus or Hindus are like X, Y, and Z, but there was a very clear pattern of behavior and targeting of that community. So I think it's understanding, having, various local bodies, state bodies, and federal bodies better understand what these different hate crimes look like, what they can look like, creating better definitions, making sure law enforcement actually reports, is, I think, required to report. I think that's the biggest gap, in my opinion, and that's what we need to do a better job of, is creating mandatory reporting by law enforcement agencies. It would probably be a little bit of a burden initially, but I think it's going to help us in terms of addressing these at a much better level, systematically.
And I would just add to that, Samir, that I think it's absolutely right to emphasize how much of this is happening on the state level. And so just to provide another couple of examples, that, we've been very instrumental in a couple of areas. One, we talked earlier about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And so there are a number of states that have adopted that in resolutions, or adopted it and incorporated that into, say, education law, to make it clear that when we are investigating discriminatory conduct that might be based on anti-Semitic motive, this is the definition that we will use. We have these examples as guiding tools. So that's one area. And then also we talked earlier about BDS, right? The boycott, divestment, sanction movement. And so the majority of the states now, some 36 or 37, I forget that, I don't remember what number we're up to now, but have adopted legislation that makes it clear that the state itself will not contract with entities. Generally, there has to be a threshold amount of money, right? But that will not enter into contracts with entities that are actively engaged in boycotting, the state of Israel for discriminatory reasons. And so that's been very effective, and we've actually been able to utilize that in some real world situations. And so again, engaging with, we talked earlier about how others can get involved in this work, engaging, within your sphere of influence. If you know legislators, if you know community leaders, even on down to the city council level, we also have a number of municipalities that have adopted the IHRA definition. And so it's gaining momentum, traction, and that's really valuable to have. So I think with that, Samir, unless you saw another question that we just absolutely have to get to.
Well, I think they're all so good, so I can't choose, but we do apologize. I think definitely please feel free to reach out to us after the program if you have more questions. You can reach me at info, at hinduamerican.org, and that will get rerouted to me. And Carly, if you want to just talk about the best way to get in touch with you.
Yeah, you can visit us at www.standwithus.com. And then for email, you can email us at info@standwithus.com for the same purposes, if there's anything that we can do to assist you. And I just want to say, again, this has been such a fantastic partnership. And Samir, I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with you and to have the ongoing relationship between Stand With Us and the Hindu American Foundation. And again, we thank you all for joining us, those who are still here, and we really do encourage you all to take this information. It has been recorded. The first session was also recorded. It will be available on standwithus.tv. The first session already is available there. So thank you all for supporting both Stand With Us and the Hindu American Foundation. And we look forward to further opportunities to be together with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.